College football nerds here talking Heisman contenders as we round out the regular season. I got my nerd Josh here with me. We're going to get nerdy with you. Please remember, like, subscribe, especially you LSU fans who are going to enjoy this video and it's going to get you a little bit riled up. Josh, I had some comments today for Twitter. And those comments centered around the fact that it is absolutely ridiculous that Jayden Daniels is not the number one odds-on favorite to win the Heisman. And I got a lot of the pretty standard responses. He's on a 3-loss team, which I think is ridiculous. His team has no defense, which I think is also ridiculous. Bo Nix is probably going to beat Washington and probably going to be in the playoffs, which to me does not matter, should not matter, especially when there's such a divergence in how they're performing. And here's the stat. This is the stat that sort of locks it all up, but there's a lot of other stats that lock it up. Jayden Daniels has had 2 games this year where he failed to hit 10 yards per attempt. By the way, 10 yards per attempt is bonkers. That is an elite season. 9+ yards per attempt is a very, very good borderline, maybe elite minus season. If you average those two out, it's 9.3 yards per attempt. That is what Bo Nix averages for the season. So against Florida State and Alabama, 2 very good defenses, one maybe the best defense in the country, Jayden Daniels hit 9.3 yards per attempt. Bo Nix, with all of his whatever Oregon has played this year, Texas Tech was their big out-of-conference game, a lot of trash defense in the Pac-12. Not necessarily Washington. I think Washington's got a decent defense. He's 9.3 yards per attempt. Bo Nix has 59 more passing attempts than Jayden Daniels, which kind of refutes the notion that he's sitting the bench and Jayden Daniels is having to play all 4 quarters. He's thrown it 59 fewer times. Jayden Daniels still has more yards passing. By the way, Jayden Daniels is a 1,000-yard rusher at 8.4 yards per attempt, I think it is. And Bo Nix is a 3-something yard per attempt guy with 321 yards rushing on the season. So he's better throwing the ball. He's more effective throwing the ball. He's impossible to stop on the ground. He's going to have a 1,000-yard season. But he's not going to win the Heisman, and Bo Nix might win the Heisman because Bo Nix's defense is better, and he plays in weaker competition. Explain this to me, Josh, because I'm having a hard time with it.
Well, I can't. Nor can I explain your comment saying Washington has a good defense. I don't know that I can get behind that one. But I think the biggest thing that comes forward is just level of competition, 1, and 2, the way people view a quarterback based on whether they win or lose. Nothing drives me more bonkers than to say such and such is a great quarterback because all he does is win. Quarterbacks don't win. Teams win. Quarterbacks throw a football and hand it off. Try to put their offense in the best position to be successful. And that's all they can do. They don't play defense. All right? They don't run the ball. They don't make the holes for the offensive line. And yeah, they can screw things up with protections. They can complement a running game well. They can make a comeback in a game where the defense isn't playing well. But they don't do all those things. And I think the overemphasis on record really kind of goes a little nuts sometimes. And I do think Jayden Daniels, probably more than most players, has been someone that's been in the wrong end of it. Because if you look at the actual schedule and the results from Daniels, compare it to, say, Bo Nix, right? Nix loses to Washington in a close game, and he's still up there for the Heisman. Penix is sitting there leading an undefeated team, really having only played Oregon. That's a really high-level team. Neither one of them played anybody decent out of conference. Who has Jayden Daniels lost to? He lost to Florida State. He lost to Ole Miss. He lost to Alabama. Okay? In the Alabama game, he only scored 28 points. The Florida State game, they only scored 24 points. The Ole Miss game, they put up 49. But if you look at what Jayden Daniels specifically did in those games, it's hard to fault him too much, right? In the Florida State game, 9.4 yards per attempt, 1 touchdown, 1 interception, 60% passing. Alabama game, actually kind of bonkers, 9.1 yards per attempt, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception, 219 yards passing, 62% completion percentage. I think we all know the Ole Miss game was just nuts. Over 400 yards passing, 75% completion percentage, 11.5 yards per attempt. Those are crazy numbers. And just to put it in comparison, right? So 9.1 yards per attempt. His worst passing game of the year was against Alabama in that defense in a loss where they only put up 28 points. He had a QB rating of 158, okay? That game, if it was his season average, would make him a top 20 passer in QB rating. And 9.1 yards per attempt would have him tied with Quinn Ewers on his season average in DJU or Jack Plummer at Louisville. That's what he did against Alabama, is what those guys have done on the year. So it's just, in my opinion, grossly unfair. And I'll throw another stat at you. We look at relative performance as the statistic that we generate on our website. You can go to collegefootballnerds.com, play around with our stats. And relative performance is just what the name implies, right? Relative to what your schedule is, what has your performance been? Are you 20% better than other teams have been against the teams you played, or are you 20% worse? If they allow you to have 5 yards per attempt and you had 7.5, you did 50% better, right? We have something we call the Nerd Performance Index, which we're just kind of playing around with, but we combined a bunch of those stats into, one combined metric. And for Jayden Daniels, his NPI score is 1.64, meaning he exceeds opponent averages across a battery of stats by 64%. And to put that in comparison, Caleb Williams is third in that stat, and he's 1.36, 36% above at baseline. Bo Nix is ninth, actually behind McCord and McCarthy at 1.32, 32% above. So Jayden Daniels literally has been 64 to 32 with Bo Nix, twice as effective, twice as differential from opponent averages. And everything you talk about with Nix has been, one, a result of having a better defense, and two, frankly, having a much easier overall schedule. And that's not to say that beating Washington's easy, but if you look at their overall schedule, the number of top 40, top 50 quality teams, I think it's only 3 or 4 they've played. LSU has played a ton of teams that have high-level offenses and defenses, a ton of teams in the top 40 or 50 in terms of overall quality. And so our sort of obsession with record takes over again from a guy that, in my opinion, Jayden Daniels is by far the best quarterback in the country right now, and he's by far the most valuable player in the country. And you talk about the Alabama game, the defining thing of that game is when Jayden Daniels got a concussion and got knocked out, and they were down 2 scores. I don't think they're going to win, but I think my prediction in that game had been like 41-34, and it ended up 42-28. I had wager money that I was right, that it was going to be a 1-score game. I think Jayden Daniels would have gone down and scored. I think Alabama would have turned around and took in the air of the ball because LSU didn't have a defense. But that's not on Jayden Daniels. So there's a lot to like about him. There's a lot to point to for why he should be higher regarded. But I just don't think voters see it that way.
The interesting thing to me is Ole Miss has LSU, Alabama, and Georgia as a common opponent. Georgia scored 52 against Ole Miss. Alabama scored 24. They struggled a little bit offensively. That's back when Miller was trying to figure things out. LSU scored 49 and lost. The difference between LSU and Ole Miss and Georgia or Alabama versus Ole Miss, Alabama gave up 10. Georgia gave up 17. That's the difference for LSU. And this notion that a quarterback can't be considered the best player in the country because his defense sucks is ridiculous. I don't look at it like, oh, you didn't win the big game. I look at it like, how many games would you have lost with your schedule if you didn't exist?
Can you answer me a question real quick?
Sure.
Daniel?
I can try.
Did Caleb Williams win the Heisman last year?
Sure did.
Did his defense suck?
Sure did.
Did they win their conference last year before he won the Heisman?
He did not.
Just
Lost
random observation.
Yeah, I think that, some might say that there's a better crop of quarterbacks this year. Or, by the way, I think Pink's had a pretty good year last year too. The Bo Nix obsession, I think Bo Nix is playing good football. I don't think he's playing elite plus football. I think if you put Bo Nix on that LSU team, they're not that close to Alabama. They don't score. I think they scored like 4 touchdowns in a row or something like that. To me, it's just, who do you want to face the least? Do you want to face LSU's offense or do you want to face Oregon's offense? And to me, 10 out of 10, I would take a game against Oregon's offense versus LSU's. LSU, and it's really all because Jayden Daniels is as effective as a passer as all the other quarterbacks, but he's also a 1,000-yard runner. That changes the dynamics of how you defend LSU tremendously, because he can beat you with his arm, but you have to dedicate a spy who's still not going to tackle him, but you can maybe get a 20-yard run instead of an 80-yard run. You have to dedicate a spy, which means you're playing with 10 guys in the field. You can play straight up and contain Bo Nix, and he's not going to kill you with his legs. He might get some runs, but he's not going to kill you with his legs. That's the difference for me. You know, when people are talking about J.J. McCarthy, there was a run against Florida Saturday, a run in a game where the quarterback threw for, I think, 370 yards and 14 and a half yards per attempt. There's a run from Jayden Daniels, one run that was longer than J.J. McCarthy's entire day's worth of passing yards. The guy is ridiculous. He's putting up better numbers than Joe Burrow did in his 2019 season. So I think we can take a step back and say, hey, this guy is putting up better passing numbers against better competition, but he's also going to run for 1,000 more yards than anybody else that's in the running with him, and just kind of shut the book on.
Well, we should, but I don't know that we will. And to the point, there's a lot more stuff you can say, right, about LSU as a team. Utah played Florida at home, beat Florida pretty soundly. That was a legitimate win. Now, that was a Florida team figuring things out. Their offensive line was an absolute abject disaster at the very beginning of the year. They didn't move the ball up and down like LSU did. They didn't move the ball up and down hardly at all. I mean, really, offensively struggled quite a bit, actually, against Florida. LSU moved the ball like it wasn't a thing, right? I mean, their yard per play numbers, I'm going to pull it up, but I think they were like close to 10 yards per play in that game. I think, let me see here. Total offense. Wrong button. Versus Florida, 8. That's 11.5 yards per play. 11.5 yards per play, 701 yards of offense. And so when we talk about, maybe this is another discussion, right? And look, if you want to hear all these different discussions, a lot of things are interrelated. Let me make a point. You made it this long in the video. Just hit the notification bell, like, subscribe, hear all the different points, and you can hear it all put together. Utah had 5.1 yards per play. They had 270 yards of offense against Florida in a game that a lot of people view as a blowout. It's 24-11. And I know they were kind of burning clock, but it was still 270 yards of offense. LSU put up 701. They averaged over double the yards per play. Every time Utah ran for 4 yards, they ran for 8. Every time Utah threw for 7, they threw for 14.
Every time LSU ran a play, they got more than a first down.
Right. And there is a little bit there where people are saying, oh, the SEC's down, the Pac-12's been up. They point to things like that Utah win. They haven't really gone back and adjusted to the fact that, Florida's already lost 5 games. They're 5-5. And when they've played other teams in the SEC, they lost to a bad Arkansas team. They got drugged by Georgia. They got drugged by Kentucky. And LSU, who's, a top offense, beat them like a redheaded stepchild. Okay? And so when you talk about the Washington-Oregon thing and you try to compare against conferences, I don't think that really shows up great either. Because I've seen a quote-unquote high-level Pac-12 team, and I know they, again, quarterback issues and whatnot, play Florida, and at least line of scrimmage-wise and whatnot, Florida held up pretty well. And then I watched LSU play them, and it was like they weren't even on the field. So I don't think there's any doubt in my mind, too, that if you put Daniels in any conference, you put that offense in any conference, they would go nuts. They are a better offense than what USC had last year when Caleb Williams won the Heisman. And again, that was a team that made the conference title, but they didn't win it. And for some reason this year, seems like people just refuse to give that kind of credit to Jayden Daniels because he happens to be in the same conference with an Alabama team that's really, really good. And I would say right now, probably overall quality, probably in pushing top 4 teams in the country. And I think it's just grossly unfair.
Yeah, I mean, you've got one decent defense in Utah, and that's it, that Oregon's faced this year. So to me, it really boils down to the fact that we have just decided that the best player on the best team gets the Heisman. And I think that is just sad to me, because it should be about more than that. It should be about the best player, the end. If it's a defensive player, whatever, the end. I do think Utah's a good defense. 35 points in that game. Bo Nix had 8 yards an attempt. I think Alabama's a better offense, and Jayden Daniels ran for like 130 yards and threw for 9.1, and it was in 3 quarters. Anything else on this before we move on to the next topic?
Well, the only other thing I'll note, I mean, the field matters a lot, but to your point about best player on the best team, there's been a lot of chatter about Harrison Jr., and you're very good at making people mad at you on Twitter. But it was a fair point, right? You talk about Harrison Jr. for Heisman. Devontae Smith, when he won the Heisman, had 40% more. If you track out to 10 games, he had 40% more yards. He had 1,856 yards in 13 games. Harrison Jr. only currently has 1,063. Smith also had 23 touchdowns in 13 games. Harrison has 12 and 10. You project that out to 10 games or ration it out. Smith was about 400 yards ahead of Harrison at the same point in time. So there's definitely a lot of best player on the best team. And I'm not saying Harrison's a bad player, but a lot of the stats and whatnot don't back it up. A lot of the best offensive players this year are not on teams that have the best record for various reasons. But, the hype train is going to go where it is. And it's always been a bit of an award that works in that fashion. But I guess I don't understand why Jayden Daniels doesn't get the credit where, for example, Lamar Jackson did. Because I think what Jayden Daniels is doing right now is as or more impressive than what Lamar Jackson did at the same, with sort of similar stats in a lot of ways, on a team that loses. But for some reason, because LSU was expected to win, I think we punished them a lot more for their losses. And that is just a reflection of our own bad expectations or a lot of media pundits' expectations, because the defense isn't nearly what they were expected to be. Offensively, LSU has greatly outperformed expectations, but because the expectations were what they were, then we feel like we have to punish LSU and we have to punish Jayden Daniels by extension. And again, it's just not fair.
All right, y'all. That's it for us on Jayden Daniels. Let us know in the comments what you think about his Heisman candidacy. And if he's not your Heisman pick, who is it? Let us know. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week.